Welcome everyone. Welcome to this webinar, which is jointly hosted by the Beam Exchange, the Donor Committee for Enterprise Development, DCED, the ILO Lab, and SAMARTH. We are delighted by the incredible number of people that signed up for the webinar, which shows that the topic of assessing systemic changes are important for the field of market systems development. Systemic change, how to target it and how to measure it, has a prominent place on Beam's learning agenda. My name is Jenal, and I am working for Beam on the topics of results measurement, impact evaluation, and evidence. I am really happy to lead you through this webinar, which is the first of the Beam Exchange webinar series, and we are really proud to be able to host this together with three of our important partners. For those of you who are not yet familiar with Beam, we only just launched in September. We are a global knowledge exchange facility for market systems practitioners. Our goal is to improve the impact and effectiveness of programs that use these approaches to create jobs, raise incomes, and improve access to basic services. This event is intended to be interactive, so I would like to invite you to ask questions. In the chat box you can select Send Questions to Staff, and we will pick those questions for the Q&A session, which will happen in the second half of the webinar. If you have any technical issues with your sound, or if you don't see the slides right now, please contact the technical support, which you can also select in your chat box. We would also like to invite you to give us your feedback about this event afterwards. We will provide you with a link to a very short survey. It should take you less than 10 minutes. This event is recorded. The recording will be available on the website, so you can either listen to it again or you can recommend it. Anyway, let me go ahead and introduce you to our presenters. Jim Tanburn, our first presenter, is coordinator of the Donor Committee for Enterprise Development, a membership grouping of 22 bilateral and multilateral agencies. One common thread in the DCED's work is improving effectiveness by learning from experience. The committee therefore published a standard for results measurement in 2008. It is noticeable that the majority of projects that have adopted this standard since then are actually aiming for systemic change. So Jim will tell us about the DCED's work on defining and developing guidance for measuring systemic change. Matt Ripley, who follows next, is from the lab, a new ILO research project that's testing ways to measure and maximize pro-poor employment outcomes through market systems development. He'll be sharing experiences using an example of recent work with a project in Timor-Leste, focusing on how to develop pathways to systemic change. Last but not least, Tim Tuckett is the team leader for a 5-year DFID-funded market systems development program in Nepal called SAMARTH. He will illustrate the practicalities of measuring change in market systems with examples from his agriculture sector projects using a recently developed qualitative measurement tool. The tool looks at 4 elements of change of market system players in the markets they work in. So with this, I want to pass the word to Jim, and again encourage everyone to ask questions for the presenters in the chat box.
Okay, Marcus, thank you very much. I guess we can move on with the slides. Look at that, fantastic. Great to see so many people registered for the webinar. As Marcus said, that indicates the level of interest. It may also indicate a sense of a problem that we all have. Let's see, there we go. I think various people can forward slides, so we'll try and stick with one at a time. So the DCED played quite a key part in launching the thinking around systems change, systemic change in service markets, say 15 years ago. Much more recently, we focused increasingly on results measurement because market systems programs are necessarily experimental and so really need to understand how they're getting on in real time. And I think experience often suggests in market systems programs that the first thing you start doing doesn't work very well, but something else that you did by accident or on the side suddenly starts taking off, and you really need to know how that's getting on in real time, so it becomes a top priority. And as Marcus said, in 2008 we asked a lot of managers of programs around market systems what is the best you can do in results measurement, and the result of that inquiry was the standard, which is an 8-part framework on measuring results to a sort of minimum credible level. Currently in use by about 100 and something projects across the world. We have a clickable map where you can see who's using it near you. But I'm not going to go into detail on the standard because we're talking about assessing systemic change, which is just one of the 8 elements. There's plenty more information online about the standard in general. So what is systemic change? It is like a present. Everybody wants one, but nobody knows what it is, what's in the box, which in a way is not surprising. You know, systems are large and complex, we know that. All parts of it are typically changing all at once. Measurement was probably never going to be easy or straightforward, and I have to say quite a few people who signed up for this webinar had questions that they asked in advance that sort of implied that there was going to be an easy way to do this. 1 or 2 indicators that would always work to assess systemic change, or a quick and easy way to do it, I quote. There probably isn't going to be a quick and easy way, but there are ways that are slightly more hard work but very effective. What is systemic change? We all know that it addresses underlying causes, but for us it's been a problem to define what is and what isn't systemic change, particularly because we in DCED we offer an audit process. If programs want to have their results measurement system audited, they can hire accredited auditors to come and look through the whole system, and we found that sometimes people would say, well, here's this business that's selling a bit more, and that's systemic change. And we would have to say, well, systemic change is often mentioned as addressing the root causes of poverty, and someone selling a little bit more probably isn't addressing the root causes of poverty. So in a way we found we were on the sort of front line of determining what is and what is not systemic change, somewhat reluctantly in a way. So after a lot of discussion among project managers, consultants and lots of others, we felt we probably had to go beyond the traditional copying and crowding in sideways links in results chains to open it up a bit more to allow programs to define their own definition of systemic change and to articulate the pathways towards that, which of course would need regular updating during implementation. Any definition, any pathways would need to have 3 qualities: resilience, sustainability and scale. And if not, then probably the system isn't changing. The adopt, adapt, expand, respond framework comes a bit later in other presentations, so I won't discuss it here except to say it also doesn't have or hasn't historically had a clear dividing line between what isn't and what is systemic. So bottom line, we need more examples of what systemic change is and isn't, probably going beyond sideways steps in results chains. People feel that they need more, but they're not quite sure what it is that they need or what it looks like. A few key messages which I think are important for us to bear in mind throughout. be clear on why you're doing what you're doing, what's the logic of it, what are the big assumptions, gather data to test the assumptions, and then use that those data to revise what you're doing and make management choices. There's a lot more on that on our website. Adam Kessler put together an overall paper called Assessing Systemic Change, and Adam's online so he can, I'm sure, field any additional questions. Finally, developing a pathway. This was the term that people felt most comfortable with, so here's a pathway, but I think it's going to be simpler than that one, with Matt Ripley, who's going to take this on and tell us a little bit more about how this looks in practice. Matt.
Thanks, Jim. So as Jim was saying, what does this pathway actually look like in practice? And we're going to use an example from an ILO project in the horticulture sector in Timor-Leste, trying to show a little bit how systemic change is more of a process than an event, a binary that's very easy to identify. So how does the pathway start? Typically, and in this instance, it starts when partnering with a company to pilot ways to overcome a problem facing smallholders. Here, in the picture at the center of the screen, you can see a collector who takes produce from farmers and sells them on to wholesale markets in the capital, and giving training and inputs to vegetable farmers. He's also providing with a buyback guarantee for a fixed amount of produce should certain quality standards be met. A form of contract farming to respond to constraints that farmers are facing in terms of access to quality inputs and access to market. So this is the first stepping stone, a pilot. Well, if this pilot is proven of benefit to both farmers and the firm and the collector, then the service is rolled out into new areas by the collector. So we get a second ripple. The service might even be adapted. For instance, the collector could open up a credit line to participating farmers. Again, another ripple. If this still clearly proves win-win and the incentives for both sides are strong, there's clear incentives on the side of smallholders, they're increasing their incomes. There's incentives on the side of the firm, whether that be profits or new customers. Then the intervention will start to encourage other, usually competing companies to crowd in around the innovation. So here, other collectors will start a contract farming model or variations of it. And this ensures that services to farmers are not just reliant on a small number of firms. So we've gone beyond the initial pilot to crowding in a wider range of market players. Finally, this might cause a response, a ripple effect in the wider system. For example, here, if farmers have greater incomes or they collaborate more to sell their produce, then they may increase their bargaining power. Other farmers outside of the contract farming may start to copy the innovations, so they might learn from their peers about simple seedbed or nursery practices. And in the widest outer ripple here, the formal rules of the game may change. So the thriving market now provoking the government, for instance, to improve its regulation of black market, low-quality seed packets, which were eroding farmers' demand for commercially provided quality seed and undercutting the market for firms. So you see, when we go from the center, a pilot through various stages in the process towards a change that is more systemic in nature. So obviously this is a very simplified pathway, and for an agriculture program, the reality is much more messy, perhaps not quite as messy as Jim's maze diagram, but I think here you can quite clearly see the three factors of scale, sustainability, and resilience. But how can we track and measure progress along this pathway in practice? Well, as one option, what we can do is try and augment and use a common tool that most of you, I'm sure, are familiar with, the results chain. So the message here is that it's important to go beyond just thinking about and drawing the logic of the pilot intervention only, so that inner ring in the target. You can see the pilot intervention logic here in simplified form, tracing change through the bottom boxes, activities that an intervention might do to pilot with a partner firm, through changes in the partner firm, in this instance the collector, him or herself, and then changes at the farm level in terms of production yields, and eventually on pro-poor impacts on incomes and jobs. But beyond this, it's important to try and map out the expected initial steps, the baby steps we can call them, towards systemic change. And here you can see a middle column added to the results chain that starts to hypothesize about where you might begin to see initial buy-in and ownership from the partner company. So in the example I was just talking about from Timor, it's unlikely that even the collector the project is initially partnering with will start to really own new ways of working, will really start to adapt to them, internalize them, until they've gone through at least one full cycle of providing inputs to farmers, embedded services, until farmers have grown produce, until the firm has bought it back, until the firm has then sold it to retailers and wholesalers in dearly at a profit. So there's a kind of trigger for where you might expect to see a higher degree of change that goes beyond a kind of very heavily project-supported change to one that might have a more systemic quality. After that, it's much more likely that other firms might start to crowd in and well, see incentives for crowding in. So the dotted lines here you can see in the right-hand column show the pathway to bringing in new collectors and the likely trigger for this and the intervention activities that might support this happening. So when you're thinking about a results chain in terms of systemic change, it's importantly not just about this kind of vertical pathway, so from the bottom to the top, from intervention activities in a pilot through to that pilot's so-called direct impact, but actually a horizontal movement as well, from left to right, from initial piloting towards degrees of change that may have a more systemic quality, from getting the initial partner firm to own new ways of working through to crowding other public and private market players in. But beyond this, results chains, from our experience, struggle to capture the kind of wider market system changes, that outer ripple effect that I was talking about in the example just now. So in the rules of the game, in say, for instance, the government being provoked into rethinking regulation on low-quality black market seeds, for instance. And results chains often also struggle to kind of put together the pieces, the extent to which many interventions come together to have a transformational effect on the market. So this is where we're going to hand over to Tim in Nepal and hear about another complementary tool that's being used to gauge progress towards systemic change.
Great, thanks very much, Matt. Now I'll illustrate how we measure change in market systems through the AAER framework with an example from our program in Nepal. Before this, I just want to briefly talk through our program, very briefly, and then to briefly talk about how the framework works. Our program has two outputs and comprises three interventions in three sectors. That's crops, livestock, and tourism. We have 25 interventions in total, as shown here. 16 interventions are in agriculture, and I shall illustrate how we measure changes in market systems using examples from our ginger project. Ginger production in Nepal suffers from low yields due to poor disease management. One of our interventions in this project is to improve access to disease management products through working with importers and distributors. We work with importers to enable improved stocks and supply of biofungicides through small-scale distributors so that farmers have easy and affordable access to the products. At the same time, we encourage market actors to work with farmers to help them improve their farming practices. Before I go into the practicality of using this tool, I'll just briefly explain how this works. What we're looking for is permanent change in market systems to ensure sustainable pro-poor growth. This means we need to carry out continual assessments to measure changes in market systems. But first, what do we mean by systemic change? Here in Nepal, we assume systemic change occurs when permanent market players take on new and improved ways of doing business beyond the life of the project. So what is the AAER framework and how does it work? The framework uses a 4x4 matrix that measures elements of systemic change that are concerned with market players adopting and adapting to new business practices or behavior. We measure changes in behavior of market players through frequent dialogue and interviews with market players initially associated with the project. We also look for and measure behavior of new market players coming into the market system, thus expanding it and copying the Propor innovation, or adding value or diversity by offering variants of it. The ultimate measure of market systems change is when overall market has responded to the Propor innovations by other non-competing market players who would adjust their own practices in reaction to the presence of Propor change. We continually assess where market players are and their response to Propor innovations. It needs to be continuous as the dynamics of the market system changes over time. So when we carry out these assessments, we measure market players' change in behavior at a point in time. So how do we measure change using this matrix? Our project teams go out to the market players to interview and assess how they've changed. To measure whether they've adopted Propor change, we're interested to know to what extent they've taken ownership for that change. And at this point in time, we're dealing mainly with market players that we've partnered with to test innovations where we've worked with them and encouraged them to take on new practices. This is the pilot stage. After a period of time, we'll find market players associated with the project that have adapted their business practice to as evidenced by further investment in the innovation made by that market player without any further support from the project. As market systems are dynamic and unpredictable, other market players that are not associated with the project may crowd in, so we look for evidence of the innovations spreading to other market players from the wider system. This could happen before we found any evidence of associated market players adapting their business practices. So expansion of the market system does not necessarily happen in sequence after adoption or adaptation. It could happen quite early on in the intervention. So project teams will also look for evidence in changes to the wider market system as a result of innovations. They will specifically look for evidence in changes in policy, rules, functions that have adjusted have been adjusted to accommodate the innovation. This will be the ultimate response to the market, of the market to the Propor changes, and will most likely have permanent and sustainable change. So let's have a look at a practical example of how we use the tool to assess changes in the market system. We turn to our example with the Ginger project. And in this, we started this innovation by partnering with two companies involved in importing disease management products for agriculture sector. We worked with these companies to help them improve their business model for import and supply of trichoderma as a disease management product for rhizome rot in ginger. So after about 6 months, we carried out an assessment by interviewing and dialogue with the market players, and found that both companies had adopted the new business model for import and supply of this product to the extent that approximately 3,000 farmers had benefited. The companies were successful in reaching out to farmers through improved distribution channels and demonstration plots. And by the end of 6 months, these companies were doing this without support from the project. Effectively, the companies now owned that business innovation. A few months later, we ran more assessments and found that one of the companies had taken the initiative to register the product with the authorities, which allowed them to enjoy lower import duties for future orders. They doubled their orders for the following season. And what this demonstrated was that the company had invested its own resources into further improving its business that benefits the small-scale farmers. More recently, the project team found evidence of 2 new companies entering the market system and that have adopted Propor innovation with very little support from the project. In essence, this happened by the project introducing the new companies to the Propor innovation demonstrated by the associate companies. There is actually a misprint on the slide there where it says under expand no signs of innovation. In fact, there were signs of innovation. That's a misprint on my part. Now there are 2 companies coming into the system, which is a further step in the right direction. but it's still not quite there yet in terms of reaching permanent change. This is still to come and not yet evident with the wider system responding to pro-port change in our project. So in conclusion then, project teams have to have a rough idea of how they want to achieve permanent changes in the market systems, which they'll do through developing results chains as Matt has described earlier. But developing and following results chains alone will not ensure permanent changes in market systems. So we use the two tools together to implement and measure permanent change. This system we use requires frequent and consistent assessment, feedback and adjustments to tactics. We do this through regular monitoring, assessments and reporting through semi-formal and informal processes. The system will work well with effective feedback loops and a willingness to learn and change tactics as we go along with implementation. Thank you, and back to you, Marcus.
Thank you very much, everyone. Very interesting slides here. Now we got already 15 questions, which is great. If you have more questions, please continue asking them in the chat box. I would like to start a Q&A session now, and I have a number of questions that I would like to ask, starting with the question for Jim. Daniel Rothwunder asks, hi Jim, could you explain the aspect of resilience in systemic change? What exactly should be resilient? The system, the change, the pathway, or the results chain? Jim, do you have an answer to that?
Yes, if only we had all the answers. Essentially, the distinction between sustainability and resilience is that sustainability would keep going past the life of the program without further external assistance, whereas resilience is the ability of market players to continue to adapt and innovate and create new pro-poor market-based solutions. So it's the adaptation and the innovation that we're looking for, something beyond just commercial sustainability of a one-off intervention.
Thank you, Jim. A question for Matt. It seems that in your example you move in a sequence from pilot to system level changes. Can you imagine that in a pilot you try to address systemic change simultaneously? Take, for example, government engagement and sector governance.
Thanks, Marcus. And yeah, great question. I mean, what we were showing there was obviously a very simplified pathway, and also importantly, only one intervention. Typically, it's actually multiple interventions coming together, connecting the dots to stimulate a systemic change. However, the program defines that in reference to the particular constraint they're addressing. So yes, it could very well be that in a pilot, for instance, you start off with a kind of quite sequential pathway, as I was mentioning there. But also at the same time, say for instance you're intervening, it may well be that you're actually intervening in trying to change government procurement policy, in legislation or rules at the same time, and you'd hope those two interventions were planned and connected. So multiple interventions coming together. And also an important point is that even though a results chain might show a nice kind of left to right linear logic, the reality is not always the same. Actually, you can start to see on experience market players might say, for instance, other collectors might crowd in around an innovation, even if it's not proven yet to be of benefit. There might be a buzz around the market. They might just think it's a great idea and want to try it out themselves. So yes, the reality is obviously always a little bit, as I said, more messy than the frameworks. But yeah, great question. It's interventions coming together, and I'm kind of thinking through the potential for kind of that non-sequential change.
Thank you, Matt. I I have a few questions that go into the same direction, and I would like to put them to Jim. One was asked by Makararavi T. Is if the project lasts for 3 years, systemic change is probably seen in the next 5 years. Who's going to invest in evaluating the systemic change? Is donor interest to spend further to just collect? Is there donor interest to spend further to just collect this information? And actually, Mike Klaassen asked a pretty similar question, and then there's a third person who asked a similar question. So there are a couple of questions around this point of systemic change not necessarily happening within the time frame of the project itself. So who's going to monitor for the changes afterwards, Jim?
Exactly. Well, first of all, yeah, I should have said hi, Daniel. Very good to hear from you, and hi, Ravi, and hi, Mike. It's great to see so many familiar names online, even if we can't hear you. Sorry about that. The question of timescale, I would say we can turn that round, and we can really say that we've got a partial solution to the problem rather than, let's say, being part of the problem, because of course it's absolutely true that systemic change can take 5 years or 20 years or more, whereas projects typically last rather shorter time, and it is very difficult. I mean, there are very few cases of much measurement or evaluation or whatever being funded a significant time after a project is finished. So typically we have to work within the time scale of the project, and there what we can do is articulate what are often quite lengthy results chains anyway, or quite lengthy sort of sequence of events or cascade of events that we're anticipating. And the best we can do is to show that the early stages of that sequence are unfolding as we had hoped during the lifetime of the project. But beyond that, there's not much, obviously, that we can do, you know, with crystal ball gazing far into the future. But we can, and I think we have to make realistic, credible projections past the lifetime of the project. Because, by the way, as an aside, if we didn't do that, market systems projects might not compare very well with projects that just use very high levels of subsidy to generate lots of results in the short term. But of course, you know, once the project's finished, everything collapses. So to some extent, what we're banking on and what we're almost promising is something a bit more durable and sustainable. But we have to build a case for that and factor it into how we look ahead. So I realize that's not a totally satisfying answer, but I think it's probably the best that we can do. Marcus, let me hand back to you. Or not, I'll just keep talking.
Thank you, Jim. I actually want to put the next question to Tim. There were a few questions. There were a few questions around the AAER tool that you presented, Tim. One comes from Philly Desai, who asked, can you explain a little more about the AAER and how it is used together with the more standard results chains? And then there is another question about the differentiation between expand and respond. And there is a question whether well, I'm not sure if you can answer that, whether AAER is actually the only tool to measure systemic change. But can you give us a little bit more about the AAER tool in general and how you differentiate between the 4 quadrants?
Unmuted.
Can you hear
Sorry,
me,
Tim,
Marcus?
I realized you were muted, I think. Can start again. Sorry. Yeah.
Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now, Marcus?
Yes, you're on. Tim, I can hear you.
Yes, just go ahead, Tim.
Okay. Right. Well, as you saw in the my presentation, there are 4 quadrants there. They adopt, adapt, expand, and respond. Adopt is when we found that the market players that we're working with have adopted new business practices that we've brought in as innovators or facilitators. And this means that what we're looking for here is where market players, or if you want, let's be specific, it might be a private sector company, or it could be a public sector organization. But that market player needs to be able to demonstrate, or we need to be able to identify that that market player has taken on board the innovation that the project has brought. That might be, you know, a new business practice, or it might be entering into a new market, or it might be involving itself in sort of different kinds of practices that it's doing right now or currently doing. And that would be very much facilitated by the project. So the project has a high level of involvement and interest at that point. Then the next element of trying to measure behavioral change takes it one step further, with those market players starting to invest more of their resources into expanding their businesses, or even taking on new innovations which are linked to the innovations that we brought in as projects. So adapt is when those market players have made further investments, either financial or in terms of human resources, or even expansion into new areas as a result of the initial innovations that we made. And that usually responds to or correlates with the first stage of the results chain that Matt was talking about, the pilot phase, which is the pathway that takes us from activities right up to poverty reduction, but just on the initial market players. That in itself is only very specific to that particular part of the market system. So adopt and adapt really speaks to trying to measure behavioral change during the pilot phase. And then when we talk about expand and respond, expand is when we start to see the shift, the strategic shift, if you like, of the intervention from just working with associates with the project, market players who are directly associated with the project, to new market players coming in who might be non-competing or competing, but they are new companies, and that was demonstrated by the latter stages of our Ginger intervention, where we had 2 new companies coming in. And the difference there is that the project might have only introduced them into the innovation through demonstration of the associate companies, but essentially these new companies have seen the advantages of working with the new innovation, and they themselves have made the decisions to come in. And we refer to that as expansion. So new market players crowding in. And the response element of market behavior, measuring market systems change or changes in market systems, is when the wider market system, including if you think of a market system having regulations and rules and policies being implemented by regulatory bodies or government, that part of the market system is now responding to those innovations, those pro-core changes that are taking place that were initially put in by the project. So it's quite difficult to describe it in practical terms, but we've seen how expansion works with new companies crowding in, and but response, where there's an overall changes in market systems at very high level, that's much harder to measure, and we've not actually experienced that yet. But that speaks to the right-hand side of the results chain that Matt was talking about, where we're looking for scale up and for crowding in of new companies. What was the other question there, Marcus?
I think you answered most of the questions, especially also the differentiation between respond and expand. I'm not sure if you want to say something more about this.
No, I don't think so, because otherwise it gets really complicated trying to sort of give you practical examples when we haven't actually got them yet for response.
Okay, thank you very much, Tim. I actually want to ask the next question to Jim again. And there are a couple of questions that are connected, and I will probably also ask Matt to answer this question as well. Mike Lassen came up with a question around some archetypes of change and focusing also a little bit about on changes that happen outside of the project's influence, but influence at the same time what the project is trying to influence. Jim mentioned, according to Mike, Jim mentioned specifically things that happen by accident or on the side. A couple of examples of these would be quite interesting or helpful, and whether they were noticed by results measurements teams or sector managers, staff on a project.
Okay. Yeah, I saw that question from Mike. Hi Mike. My impression from my limited experience is that it's almost more the rule than the exception, that things change direction quite substantially during implementation, but in the light of learning by doing and just surprises that happen along the way. Whether there are documented examples of that or not put it like this, we get a lot of inquiries, a lot about, probably one of the most common inquiries is what do we do with our very expensive baseline now that we're not doing what we thought we would be doing in the first place, and do we have to do we have to start again with a brand new baseline in the new area or technology? And I mean, one example that does spring to mind is that the years ago, the sort of famous Uganda radio station example that Springfield and others have used quite a lot, it sort of happened by accident that the project that was working in Uganda was actually looking at agricultural value chains, and then the Ugandan radio situation got liberalized, and suddenly it became extremely dynamic and innovative and full of opportunity, and so the whole thing changed direction quite fundamentally within 6 or 12 months of starting the project to take advantage of an opportunity. But I don't know, one could document a lot of other examples probably. Marcus, back to you. I think it was just that question you gave me now.
Yes, thank you, Jim. I would actually be interested if there is some viewpoint from Matt as well on this question.
Yeah, only just to add on that, I think using the infamous words of Mr. Ronsfeld, I think it's more a matter of, especially for results measurement, being aware of the known unknowns. So from our experience, yes, sometimes it can be completely out the blue, but we're not here talking about a completely scattergun approach to impact at scale. Projects work quite hard to develop a vision for what a pathway to systemic change might look like, and of course that changes drastically over time in accordance with the circumstances. An example, a mechanization project that started out in a very kind of a lot of thought into a pathway around piloting with one particular firm who was importing agri-mechanization equipment to change the way they do social marketing and after sales, and as part of their good work as a market facilitator, they knew who all the main actors were in the system, and at the beginning of the project they kind of had a quick kind of overview and presentation with all those main actors and said, well, look, this is what we think the market opportunity is, this is what we're going to do about it, and we're going to partner with firm X to pilot. Well, about a year later in the pilot, they turned up to an industry fair and found that firm Y, one they weren't piloting with, but who'd heard about the initial presentation, had got a stand and was selling and promoting agri-mechanization equipment in the way that was envisioned by the project. And they asked, well, were you doing this before? They said, no. I said, why are you doing that? And they said, well, we heard about this great opportunity. We wanted to give it a go. So it was unexpected, but it wasn't completely unknown and off track. So a little example there about kind of market intelligence and good adaptive vision to a pathway to systemic change that can actually have those kind of more unexpected changes that have a systemic quality.
Thank you very much, Matt. I would like to ask a very practical question to Tim that comes from Anna Garlock. She asks, can you talk a bit about how you run your quarterly strategic review meetings, how you instruct staff to keep tabs on the AAER process, and how that feedback comes back to you? And I actually have a related question around whether you actually had some failure failures, things that didn't work that you identified during these kind of reviews and adapted your intervention afterwards, actually being more successful. This question comes from Thomas Tikar. Tim.
Yeah, thanks, Marcus. I've got that. Just to talk about the first question on our quarterly strategic review meetings. This is a common practice that we do, and staff are aware of it, and the staff are expected to prepare for it. The other thing as well that's very important is that staff, or the project teams, should I say, are very familiar with the AAER framework, and the whole reporting mechanism, right down to the field project teams, is based on how that AAER framework works. And they are actually equipped with sets of questionnaires which speak to indicators for the various different elements. And these indicators are really what the project teams are expected to look out for on a regular basis. That'll be every month or as the intervention continues. And we have quite structured quarterly strategic review meetings. Obviously, I won't go into the detail of that, but at those meetings, the project teams respond in terms of what they found of behavioral change and speaking to those indicators that helps us to identify at what point market players are in that change process. So it's a matter of making sure that staff are aware that they're fully equipped with the tools of the framework and the sort of types of questions that would be asked. The feedback comes to me through we have a portfolio manager, we have an operations manager who manages all of the interventions and who keeps tabs on this on a fairly frequent basis. But it comes to me on a quarterly basis through these quarterly strategic review meetings, which I manage and I facilitate. And I am actually made aware of the contents of those meetings before we actually go into them, so I know what I'm looking for before I go into those meetings. So it's really a matter of discipline and making sure that staff and project team members understand what's required of them. In terms of failures, which I think came from no, I can't remember who it came from, but yeah, we have had failures. We've had, I mean, again, I won't go into the detail of it because it's quite complex, but we found that there was no movement in behavioral change beyond the associated partners in our vegetable project, and this led us to wonder whether there was genuine market systems change, whether this was something to do with the way we were implementing or the tactics we were using. So to cut a long story short, we did change the tactics for our vegetable intervention and the vegetable sector projects, and now we have a much more focused intervention which is leading to market systems change, and we are beginning to see evidence now of wider market players responding. So yeah, this does work, and I think it's extremely important that when we're looking at results that we are very cognizant of failure reporting as well, not just reporting on successes, because there's a lot to be learned from failure reporting. Failure reporting is quite hard to manage though, because obviously people get very defensive about reporting on things that haven't worked. And back to you, Marcus.
I would actually like to take the privilege to answer the last question myself. The question comes from Ryan Bork. It's about, I'd be curious to hear more about some of the other methods that we might be looking at to measure pro-poor outcomes for market systems development, and whether there has been some experiment with tools like SenseMaker and network mapping or other types of tools drawing from the complexity sciences. That's a very interesting question. I think there are actually many tools out there that might not have been directly experimented with or in a very small extent in market systems development. There are a few projects that actually do experiment with these tools, and I know that Ryan himself and the organization he works for is involved in many, if not most, of those projects that actually do experiment with these novel tools. And what I want to say is that from the side of the Beam Exchange, we are very interested to work with these and document the experiences that are made by through the experiments with these kind of tools that come out of complexity sciences, because there has been some indications that they can be very helpful for measuring systemic change. Now with this, I would actually like to close the Q&A session, and I would like to give the speakers another chance for a last round, and I would like to start with Jim. I would just follow the same sequence as during the presentations.
Thanks, Marcus. Yes, pity in a way we're running out of time, but that's the way it is. Great questions from Jean and Muaz and all kinds of other old friends. So maybe we can take those offline, or we can continue in some other way. I think the only thought that I'd leave people with is to try to keep this as simple as possible, because it's already quite a lot of work to do the basics. I think there's been a tradition in assessing or measuring anything over the years for you know, very clever people to come up with very clever methods, but people who are in the field, you know, have so many other things on their mind that we have to make it as practical as we possibly can. And I think that's a constant challenge, is, you know, what's the minimum to be credible while still being doable and feasible and worth spending some time on without going overboard. So I think going forward, that's the only sort of encouragement I'd have, and I think the examples we've had from Matt and Tim and so on have been fantastic. So let's build on all that. Thanks, Marcus. Back to you.
Thank you very much. Maybe Matt, something you want to leave with the participants?
Thanks, Marcus. Yeah, as Jim was saying, a lot of great questions that hopefully we can follow up with offline if you didn't get it answered live today. Yeah, just to leave with a message from the lab, that we're really trying to look into the research agenda on the employment impact through market systems development, with a focus on job quality and working conditions in particular. So we'd be very keen to hear from projects or people or organizations with experience in taking a systemic lens to tackle any of the many jobs problems facing those in poverty and in low-income contexts. So yeah, you'd be happy to follow up on that, and particularly around systemic approach.
Thank you very much, Matt. And then I would like to hand it over to Tim.
Thank you, Marcus, and thank you everyone for the questions that came my way. There's still some very interesting questions that I would like to answer, but I think I probably will have to do that through emails. But the main message I think that comes from my side is looking at it from a practical perspective, is that we need to have some sense of where we're going. We need to know what sort of changes we know we can make, and this comes about from good effective understanding of the market systems, good planning through results chains, but planning right through to what we call scale up and crowding in, and making sure that we know at what point there is that strategic shift from pilot to expansion. but also to sort of bear in mind that these tools and frameworks that we've talked about today really are just tools to help us to do our work. And we need to be fairly flexible, this being a very qualitative process. And I think we've got to be very much on the case of doing these assessments on a very frequent basis so that we can keep an eye on where the market changes or where the behavior is changing, or if there is no behavior change, so we can respond pretty quickly to that. And also not to be afraid of failure. I think it's important that we understand where the failures are or where the blockages are so that we can make those sorts of changes as and when we need to. So constant feedback, constant learning, I think, is really important as a practitioner from our side. Thank you, Marcus.
Thank you very much, Tim. With this, well, thank you, everyone. With this, I would like to close the webinar. First of all, I would like to thank you for your very active participation and all the good questions. As was mentioned by the panelists, there are many more questions that we couldn't answer. We will try to follow up on these. We'll find a way to get them answered. We very much hope that you could get some ideas about systemic change and systemic change measurement that are relevant for your work. We also put together for you resources. You have been seeing them for a while on the screen. As you cannot click the links on the slides, we are also posting, or we have been posting them into the chat box, so you can actually click on them right there. The website of the DCED provides a host of resources around measuring systemic change in private sector market systems development, so I'd encourage you to go there and look around. The ILO's Value Chain Development Guide for Decent Work is also a great resource for guidance on designing market systems projects for the labor market. And SAMARTH's report called Making Sense of Messiness is an excellent description of how they use results chains and the AAER framework. So if you are interested in these tools, I'd encourage you to read this report. Finally, on the BEAM website, we have prepared a page with general introduction to measuring systemic change that will have more links on it you can follow. There are a great deal more of resources on market systems approaches in general on our website, so I'd also encourage you to visit it, and you can sign up to be informed in the future as well. Also check out our LinkedIn page and group where you can contribute to the ongoing discussions. And well, last but not least, I would also like to thank our three presenters very much for their contributions. I thought it was a really great and really interesting insight into cutting-edge thinking on measuring systemic change. And finally, again, asking you to please participate in our survey. It's a very short survey. You will have the link in your chat box. So we'd like to learn about what you could take away from this webinar, and we'd like to improve our webinars in the future. We hope that you enjoyed this event with BEAM, the DCED, ILO, and SAMARTH, and we wish you a very good rest of your day.